Nothing is true, everything is permitted. Across the various timelines and protagonists of the Assassin's Creed series, this motto has remained constant, taken from Vladimir Bartol's 1938 novel Alamet. The series uses it to endorse a sort of individualistic freedom, encouraging players to challenge social norms and instead dictate the course of their own lives. It is a fitting message, given the premise of the first game, released during the height of the War on Terror. The first Assassin's Creed chose not to cast the player in the familiar role of a Western soldier invading the Middle East, as seen in titles such as Call of Duty and Medal of Honor, but rather had the player act as part of a Syrian rebel group with the distinct goal of pushing back European invaders during the Crusades. The allegory is clear, and with it comes a radical tone that more recent entries in the series have backed away from. Though not always remembered well due to a repetitive nature that had the player repeating monotonous investigations prior to each fundamental assassination mission. The first Assassin's Creed game's prominent concepts are profounder than many give it credit for. There is a reason for that infamous disclaimer about the developers being a multicultural team made up of different faiths that fades in when the game is initialized. While the first Assassin's Creed is sometimes remembered as a glorified demo for future entries, its unique tone gives us a feel all its own which sets it apart from and, in some ways, above the later titles in the series. First receiving an English translation in 2004, Alamet is a 1930s Slovenian novel from author Vladimir Bartol, which first began seeing mass attention from the Western world as terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda started becoming more dominant in the public eye. The story was written as an allegorical condemnation of Mussolini and his fascist tactics, as it used a mythologized version of the Hashashin, westernized as assassin sect of Islam, to highlight how Mussolini would manipulate soldiers and the public into following his cause. Its plot follows a young man known as Ibn Tahir, as he's forced into a Hashashin rebel group built on a cult of personality surrounding its leader, Hassan I-Sabbah. Tahir is forced to assassinate leaders of competing sects of Islam before eventually turning against his master after being tipped off to his deceptive ways by a former target. During his final confrontation with his master, Hassan tells Tahir his motto: "Nothing is an absolute reality, all is permitted." Though the book was originally written to comment on European politics and was ignored by the English-speaking world, scholars began to look at Alamet as an invaluable breakdown of the sorts of recruitment and indoctrination tactics employed by Osama bin Laden and others like him. The allegory of Alamet suddenly found itself being used to analyze the war on terror, making it a perfect setting for works of fiction seeking to comment on the issue. Those who remember the original Assassin's Creed may have found themselves having a fit of deja vu while comprehending the above synopsis of Alamet. This is no accident, aside from the science fiction elements setting up Assassin's Creed's frame story, a literary technique that serves as a companion piece to a story within a story, where an introductory or main narrative sets the stage either for a more emphasized second narrative or for a set of shorter stories. Consequently, the plot of the first game follows that of the novel almost to a T. In the first Assassin's Creed game, players assume the role of Altair, a disgraced assassin from the Syrian city of Masyaf who is seeking redemption after breaking his order's creed. To seek redemption and make up for his transgressions, he's assigned to kill 9 war profiteers and crusader leaders who are helping to further the European crusades to take the Holy Land. The hope is that doing so will help end the crusades with as little bloodshed as possible, as is the public goal of the assassins. Like Ibn Tahir, Altair assassinates targets who give him valuable information upon their death, while also criticizing his methods and defending their own tactics. Although these rationalizations often ring false, Altair eventually begins to question whether the assassins are unprejudiced and righteous. By the end of the game, he finds himself returning home to see the entirety of Masyaf under the power of the assassin leader, Al-Mualim, who has secretly been using Altair to eliminate competition for control over a powerful artifact, the Apple of Eden, which allows him to indoctrinate people to his way of thinking. This mirrors Hassan's use of hashish in Almut, as he would drug his soldiers to convince them that he could perform miracles, and as such convince them to obey him. The game ends on a climactic fight between Altair and Al-Mualim in the ethereal gardens behind his castle, after which Altair finds himself studying the secrets of the apple in a quest for enlightenment, similar to a worldwide journey Tahir takes at the end of Alamut. It is not often that classic novels find themselves adapted into video games, yet Assassin's Creed's choice to use Alamut as a base gave it an intriguing setting, rich with conflict and competing factions with no easy solutions in sight. Most importantly, due to the recent scholarly reinterpretation of Alamut, it helped connect the game to similar current events. When Assassin's Creed was first released in 2007, the United States and parts of Europe were embroiled in conflict in the Middle East, in a series of military campaigns known as the War on Terror. Naturally, the conflict began immersing into media, even in films such as Zero Dark 30, and video games were not immune to this influence, as the real-life War on Terror helped to inspire settings for a burgeoning new genre, the military first-person shooter. Perhaps the most notable example, Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, also came out in 2007, reinventing a series of World War II shooters into a bombastic fetishization of modern military grandiloquence. These games have been accused by some for acting as military propaganda or, at the very least, military worship. In fairness' sake, it is also worth mentioning that the major villains in these games are often either Russian military leaders or corrupt Americans. However, the moment-to-moment action of the modern military genre can look like a shooting gallery, where the player must shoot as many people as possible. There are games like Spec Ops: The Line which manage to subvert this, but also titles such as 2012's Medal of Honor reboot, which play the situation by imitating and delivering an uninspired and banal title, therefore failing to secure a unique narrative identity. While Assassin's Creed is not a shooter and does not literally take place during the War on Terror, it is difficult to avoid drawing connections between the two, given Altair's place as part of a small idealistic group of freedom fighters led by a manipulative leader, staving off Western invaders looking to establish themselves as the dominant power in his Middle Eastern homeland. When taken in light of the time of the game's release and the elements it borrows from Alamut, Assassin's Creed's Crusades begin to feel like an allegory for the War on Terror, intentional or not. It seems as if the game's designers were aware of this reading of its story, which may be the reason for the disclaimer about the developers being a multicultural team seen at the beginning of the game. After all, whereas titles such as Call of Duty and Battlefield had the players fighting to take down local rebel groups, Assassin's Creed arguably cast the player as a member of one of said groups. In this way, It switches the perspective, usually seen in games about the war on terror, to one hardly explored, that is, of the local militia members. This alone is perhaps the game's boldest choice, as it sympathizes with and humanizes people that the news media at the time portrayed as inherently violent and beyond help. With this in mind, it could be easy to read Assassin's Creed as a pro-terrorist game, essentially having the player kill Western soldiers as part of a terrorist cell, but to do so would be to ignore the game's most subversive element, that is, a wider message of de-escalation. In accordance with the public message of the Assassins, Altair hopes to end the Crusades, achieve freedom for his homeland, and stop the bloodshed. Of course, for an organization known as the Assassins, there is a touch of irony to this goal. How can he hope to end violence through the use of violence itself? After slaying his targets, several of them either insinuate or directly ask him the questions. And yet, when speaking to Al-Mualim, the assassin philosophy becomes clear. To end the war with as little violence as possible, that they must kill is treated as a dark burden, but a necessary one if the assassins are to achieve their goal. Rather than meeting the Crusaders on the battlefield, they instead covertly sneak into cities and take out their leaders individually, hoping to destroy the infrastructure of the enemy troops and end the war without risking the casualties of a full-on conflict. It is an intriguing take on an open-world game, whereas titles such as Grand Theft Auto encourage the players to cause as much violence as possible. Assassin's Creed asks the players to get through the game with as few casualties as they can, even desynchronizing any player who assassinates civilians. Altair even gives the impression of being a man of the people, siding with vigilantes, scholars, and the clandestine operatives to free their cities from tyranny. On the contrary, to pretend that the assassins are always restrained in violence, and thus without fault, is to do the game's setting a disservice. With the final confrontation in the game being with the assassin leader himself, it is only natural that the assassins get their fair bit of criticism from the game's narrative. This is seen as Altair begins to doubt the assassin beliefs as each new kill weighs more and more on his conscience, causing him to debate with Al-Mualim after every mission. Even if killing is restrained and treated as a burden, is it still right to use violence to end violence? The game does not answer this directly, but rather allows the player to consider where they stand on it by introducing a complex moral question with no easy solution. Again, this mirrors real life. What is also important is that death itself is treated with weight and clearly affects the emotional arcs of several of the game's most important characters. In this way, the game manages to humanize members of local rebel groups without condoning extremist actions. By having the narrative show empathy without acceptance, the assassins are fairly criticized and yet also have an equal chance to have their arguments heard. The message that Altair simply wants his homeland to be free is valiant, but Al-Mualim's callousness towards killing and manipulative fervor are soundly dismissed as having no place in a peaceful society. As such, the game asks players to consider members of local militias in embattled regions as simply being human beings who are the products of their circumstances rather than crazed zealots. It does not claim that their tactics are always ethical, but rather asks the players to consider why they might fight and how those issues could be addressed to de-escalate existing conflict and prevent future clashes. In showing understanding without praise, the game's story manages to walk a thin line between having the player act as part of what is arguably a local insurgent group and siding with said groups, the end goal of which is a more considered viewpoint which treats enemy combatants as human beings rather than foot soldiers. It should also be noted that many of Altia's targets are also from the Holy Land, though that does not really reduce their role as warmongers. To the assassins, these figures are provoking war as much as European invaders, and so are just as guilty of bringing conflict to their homeland. However, this does manage to portray war-torn populations as diverse and consisting of a number of multiple viewpoints, which again serves to elevate local concern as being multi-tiered and worth considering. Upon reflection, this prompts a reconsideration for the game as the series stretches into its 13th installment. The first Assassin's Creed still stands as a notable example of giving the player control over a character who would otherwise be an enemy in other similar games. Through this simple perspective shift, the developers were able to pose questions about violence and the motivations of local freedom fighters, which did seem all too poised to coincide with the real-world political events surrounding the game's release. In comparison to the scope of the first game, new stories in the series cannot help but seem as smaller and less radical, raising questions about the disclaimer at the opening of each new title that is it even necessary at this point. Whereas Altair Ibn-La'Ahad was a man who some might claim to be an extremist, Ezio Auditore da Firenze was pitched more as an Italian nobleman who grows in stature from gallant child to master assassin, then mentor and eventually assassin general, who once as a callous young man fought to avenge his family members, in time discovered a noble purpose, discernibly seeing past the black and white morality. But Connor Kenway, though again helping revolutionaries fight against a larger power, also fought in a much more publicized period of history than Altair, and on a side with which many Westerners agree. But what is troubling is how he fought for the Americans despite the oppression of local Native American tribes. Occasionally, this conflict between his dual heritages was explored, but by the end of the game, Connor Kenway was raising American flags and even using a westernized name with no issues. Meanwhile, Black Flag, albeit a remarkable accomplishment, expresses a pirate story devoid of the core idea of the franchise's identity. Arno Victordorian, who is paralleled to Ezio, deserved to become that mystical ideal in revolutionary France, but was unfortunately disregarded for the Fry twins in an unremarkable narrative set in London. The sense of engagement in story and settings have not been as engaging as it was in the first game and the Ezio trilogy, and over the course of time, the series has incorporated linear and traditional cultural paradigms which fabricate them as unappealing and derivative. When Assassin's Creed 2 was released, it did much to bring the series into line with conventional open-world game development. An experimental mission structure replaced the former routine of investigation followed by assassination. Weekly segments and side activities were added to the game for giving it variety, and the game sported a thriving economic system. Ezio was altered with certain conventions of the pulpier genre, and his story took a far more personal tone. All of this made for engaging entertainment, but with it came a sense of amnesia over the first game's themes. Though Ezio still spoke with targets after killing them, these felt like perfunctory conversation in which he did not show much remorse, whereas Altair questioned Western conceptions of who could serve as a hero. Ezio drew from the classic Western hero archetypes such as Zorro and even Batman. And whereas the assassins were originally presented as a local rebel group, they more and more began to take on the appearance of a secret society, with their methods no longer being called into question but rather celebrated. I cannot help but wonder if what the series has gained in features, it has lost in setting. Since the launch of Assassin's Creed 3, the radical choices of the first game and the Ezio trilogy have been slowly sanded off with each new installment. This may give the series a broader appeal, but it also shows a lack of faith in the supposed central conceit of Assassin's Creed. We are told that the motto of each game is "nothing is true, everything is permitted," and yet as the series continues to ditch its most subversive elements in favor of standard open-world game design, it compromises on that very message. As such, any claims it makes about freedom feel hollow at best, and no longer permitting itself to challenge its audience's ideals, it forgets the same creed after which it is named.